Welcome back, everybody. So a recent study done by a South African recruitment agency showed that 30% of young people leave their jobs within 3 months of being employed. Though the study pointed out that the problem predominantly stems from a lack of work readiness skills. The study proves this dropout rate to be worrisome, as 38.2% of South Africa's youth is now unemployed. Joining us in studio is Jake Willis, the CEO of Lulaway Youth Employment Agency. They actually conducted this study. Good to see you. Thanks very, very much for coming in, Jake.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about this study and your research. What led to it?
So I mean, we haven't really gone out to sort of do a study. Basically, that's what we do. I mean, we place people in in entry-level positions day in and day out. And over the years, I think we've placed in the region of 30,000+ people. And what we started finding over time is sort of we go through all of the work to find the people, to place them, to talk to the companies, to get them in there. And then a week later, we get a call from the company saying, "Okay, let's start this exercise again." Yeah. And we're like, "Okay, what happened there?" And this just kept on recurring. So all we really did is start basically keeping a little bit of stats as to what's going on. And it really became alarming to realize that many of these kids drop out. And kind of even more worrying is the fact that you find people, you phone them, and they don't want to go to the interviews. You send them to the interviews and they don't show up. And there really is just a substantial level of I don't know if it's pickiness or some format of the guys are basically not always wanting to go to the jobs that they have, yeah. And often have some kind of a dream idea of what a job will look like.
Okay, so let's get a couple of basics out the way. What kind of job seekers do you have on your books? I mean, who are we looking at predominantly?
So it's predominantly, Black South Africans, yeah. Young entry-level guys. Interesting stats, and we're actually hoping to release something, which goes a bit more in depth into it, is 75 to 80% of the people in our database are women. So that's just another interesting point around sort of the men in South Africa and what they want to do and that kind of a thing. But basically those are the entry-level young job seekers, millennials, I suppose, if you want to call them.
Qualifications? What kind of qualifications?
So it's starting from almost half of them don't have matric. A lot of them have matric. A lot of them have diplomas of sorts. A lot of them have degrees of sorts. So it really crosses across the spectrum whether you have a qualification, don't have a qualification, a lot of the guys are just not going to the interviews that they're sent to, not staying at the jobs that they have. Yeah. It's a very interesting conversation I just had now with a lady on my way here, and she was basically telling me. So I was telling her that I'm going for to have a conversation about this. And she said, yeah, her son is actually sitting at home with a degree for the last 2 years. He's sitting at home. And I said to her, you know what, I'll bet you that guy somehow got an opportunity somewhere and walked out of it. Mm-hmm. And she says, yes, he actually had an opportunity, but she says, no, that was for justifiable reasons because, there was some issue going on there. And she says he's very worried about being exploited. Yeah. And, it just came to me and I said, you know what, but what is he doing? So he's so worried about being exploited at the job, so he's staying at home and living off your salary. Does that not mean he's exploiting you? I think that's just a conversation that we should have.
I think it's a good conversation to have, but I think we need to look also at circumstances, but perhaps the circumstances that they go to in these jobs. Are these employers taking advantage of these young, unemployed, desperate people? For instance, do we take into account the transport costs to get there? Do we take into account things that, the living conditions and the things that people have to actually meet? Yes, there's one thing getting work experience, but there's also another thing going to this job, but losing money and actually thinking, well, why am I coming here? I'm actually losing money and I'm not getting a thing out of this. It costs me more to get to this job. I can't do all of this. Do you speak to the guys when they leave the job? Yes, you speak to the employee, but do you actually speak to you speak to the employer. Do you speak to the employee to say, listen, what went wrong? Was it because they weren't paying you enough? Were the circumstances bad? I suppose to get both sides of the story.
So for sure, I mean, we speak to all sides of the equation, and often we're able to sort of talk to. I mean, we have a work readiness induction kind of process that we put 3 people through, which we've developed with the Dell Foundation, and we run the EBSA Ready to Work program as a sort of induction process. And these are the type of things that we discuss with them, and we have seen about 10 to 15% increase in retention when we do this, when we go through this process correctly. And yeah, entry-level jobs are not fun. I mean, there's no two ways about that. I think I could speak for myself and say that when I was 20 and, going to my first job, I moved furniture, I carried boxes.
Yeah. You do start at the bottom. You do.
Yeah, you do that. I mean, that's as simple as that. And you're talking about desperate job seekers. I think the concern that's starting to rise for me more and more is to say, is there really a desperation? Which, in a way, I mean, I know when I was 20, I was desperate. I was very, I really, really, really wanted to get my foot into the working world. I had no other choices. I'm finding that increasingly young people here, they don't want to be exploited, they don't want to be desperate, and they're looking to sort of waltz into the working world. And as much as, there's been a huge conversation over the last 20 years about making sure that government provides enough opportunities, does enough to push people into the working place, that employers treat people correctly and all of that kind of a thing, I really think we need to start having a serious conversation about the responsibilities of unemployed job seekers to say, when you get an opportunity, how far are you going in keeping it? How quickly are you, there to jump and say exploitation, and just realize that, entry-level jobs are just not fun.
Yeah. When you talk about, in the survey as well, you talk about social capital, where you say that young people have a lack of social capital. What are you referring to here?
So to me, social capital is exactly, is sort of understanding what it takes to get into the working world. Understanding, the type of things that in many cases, if you grow up in sort of more stable families with, with parents that are working, you're going to have these sort of, these conversations at the kitchen table about what does it work. I'll tell my kids that when I started working, it wasn't so easy, and I did, all kinds of terrible jobs. So that when they go into a first job and it's not exactly, all pretty and whatever it is, they're going to know that, okay, their father also went through that. A lot of kids in this country, for many reasons, don't have those kind of conversations, and that's the sort of social capital. It's also networks, obviously, knowing people that could get you into jobs and that kind of a thing. But to me, the really important thing is to sort of start getting kids to a stage where they understand that getting a nice job, a decent job, is a process. You don't just waltz into a sort of beautiful office, start doing your thing, and live happily ever after.
Yeah, it is quite difficult, because a lot of the youth have changed in the way that they operate, and jumping from job to job to job is something that the youth tend to do these days. Whereas in previous times, my father was like that. I tend to be like that too. Sort of get to a job and stay in it and try and nurture it and be in it for as long as possible. And maybe I have that school of thought, but the younger generations are not like that. They kind of they move so fast that I can't keep up. They change cell phone numbers and jobs faster than the fastest car out there. And I suppose, is it not the way that the world is moving? Is that not the way things operate? Or are you looking at it from a different perspective? Like, when you get into the workforce, you can't be chopping and changing so fast. You need to get experience at any cost and then perhaps move on. But going into a job for 1 month and leaving is not necessarily getting you experience.
So I don't.
Because your stats, sorry, just getting into them, where I was leading with this question is you're showing that young people were placed in a job. 16% of them would leave the workplace in the first month of their job.
So I don't have an issue with people leaving a job for a better job. I mean, just in our employees, across the board, I tell them, guys, if you have a better job, don't be scared to tell me. I mean, nobody could. If I'm paying you X and someone else could pay you double that, I cannot tell you to stay. I think it's the correct career move to a better job. That doesn't normally happen after a month. What we find across the board, the biggest issue is people don't leave from one job to go to another job. They leave from one job because they feel that it's not fulfilling, it's not this, and a host of issues. I mean, one lady told me, that job was exploitation because the toilet wasn't clean enough, or because they needed to sell something that they didn't absolutely believe in. There's a whole host of sort of reasons why they leave. But Again, I don't have an issue with people leaving to go to a better job. I tell them, if you're working in a place and you hate your job, that's fine. But you get to that job at 9 o'clock in the morning or at 8 o'clock or whatever it is, on your way back home from work or on your way to work, have a stack of CVs, go on the internet, apply to other jobs. And the one thing that an employer is always going to ask you when you're going into a job is, what are you doing right now?
Yeah.
And if you're working somewhere, whatever it is, whether it's a cleaner, it's a this, they'll be a lot more impressed than if you say, I sit at home and watch TV.
Yeah, which is, it doesn't sound or look too good on your CV, does it?
Doesn't.
What would you say to guys out there? I mean, the advice, and guys and ladies that are watching, they're desperate for jobs. Perhaps they've been in the situation that you're talking about. They've gone into a job, they've looked at this environment and said, I just can't do it. I'd rather be sitting at home doing nothing. This is not what I want to do. What is the advice? What is it that we complain about the unemployment rate in South Africa, and yet, as you're saying, people go into a job, they look at one thing and they leave. What advice can you give people?
It's simple advice: stick it out. I think unless it's absolutely exploitative and it's sort of terrible environment, but the definition of a terrible environment can't be too broad. Just because you have to work hard and because there's some things that you don't like about a place doesn't make it automatically into a terrible environment. You get into a job, you stick at it, and if you don't like it, you keep on looking. If you're not getting paid enough, keep on looking for better jobs. Keep on looking for opportunities to advance in your own company. Keep on looking for opportunities to fix what's going on there. I'm just talking to an employer now, which we placed a candidate there, and he's got some diploma in, I think, engineering or whatever it is, and he's been put in that position because in some kind of an assistant, position. So he's complaining about, how could we put him there and how could he be working in such a kind of a place when he really wants to find out about engineering. So I spoke to the employer and I said, what's the story? He said, listen, there were 5 engineering problems in our organization over the last month, and if that guy would step up and say, could I help fix this because I've got a diploma in this and because I could do it, with absolute pleasure we would have given him an opportunity, and if he would have done that, he could have moved into other places. Yeah. But instead, he's much more comfortable to go out and to complain to external parties about why we're not giving him the opportunities. When you're in a position, don't always look for outside forces to help. Yes, we've been having a conversation about saying, that government is not helping enough, that employers are not helping enough. And I really believe, not to say the government is perfect or that they're doing everything they can, but there is certainly a huge amount of work and effort that's going into assisting young people to sort of get into workplaces. And I really think we need to start having a conversation about saying, what do you do when you get into that workplace? How much effort are you putting in there? How much effort, how much pain are you willing to take in the workplace to be able to get your foot into the working world?
Lovely. Thank you for talking to us, Jake. Attitude changes needed in our new employment youth. Well, that's, I suppose, a decision we need to take and talk about more. Jake Willis is a CEO of Lulaway Youth Recruitment Agency, and they're talking to us about their study that they found 30% of young job seekers who leave their employment within the first 3 months.